Yeah, good people. Well, there you have Governor Godwin Obaseki basically calling for calm, but also venting his frustration about the election over the weekend. He said that there was a lot of impunity and blatant disregard of law and process. But this is what the election came to eventually, according to INEC. Let us show you the eventual result of that election. And there you have it, the APC's Monday Okpebolo with 291,667 votes, followed by the PDP's Ighodalo with 247,274 votes. And coming in third place with votes obviously much lesser than the others is the Labour Party's Olumide Apata with 22,763 votes. So that's INEC giving out the result of the election. The winner has, of course, taken the victory. The one who didn't win is saying, we're not going to take this. But what really played out over the weekend in Edo State, and how has it affected the result, the credibility of that process and the result? We're joined by the Executive Director of YIAGA Africa, Mr. Samson Itodo. He's still there in Benin City, at the Edo State capital where the election took place. Mr. Itodo, welcome to the Morning Brief.
Thank you very much and good morning.
I imagine you've not been able to catch some good sleep, but it's expected, it's election, right? Seeing the result of that election, how INEC called election, the APC's Monday Okpebolo with 291,000, the PDP's candidate with just 240-something thousand votes, Labour Party with 22,000 votes. But you have released a statement. All of the election observers came together, released a statement. So I'd like to know, really, when you see those numbers, what comes to mind? What are the events that culminated in the figures that people are either celebrating or contesting from what you observed over the weekend?
Well, Kayode, as you are aware, YIAGA Africa deployed the process results verification for transparency methodology, which is a gold standard for election observation, where we assess the quality of the electoral process and then verify whether the results announced by INEC is a reflection of the votes cast. Now, we've deployed this methodology for 2 presidential elections, for 16 off-cycle governorship elections. So this election is the 17th governorship election we're deploying this methodology. Now, the protocol for the methodology is such that I wouldn't be able to speak, to this outcome this morning because later this morning we would release our final results on our assessment of the results announced by INEC. But here are a few things. I think the first thing to note when you look at this entire process, it shows that, one, that we still have a long way to go with respect to sanitizing our electoral process, because what is disturbing is this sort of regression in the quality of our results management process. And we're beginning to see, old tactics of election manipulation resurfacing in our electoral process. And that is really sad. The second, issue to note is that when you look at this election, from the commencement on election day down to when voting ended and results were recorded, INEC consistently applied its guidelines. The beavers functioned optimally across the state. And I must also say that, one, voters who were on the queue, at 2:30 had the opportunity to cast their vote. But when it came to the results collation, and that's why at least 6 of those who deployed election observer groups who deployed, observers for this election yesterday issued a joint statement, quite unprecedented, And the reason is that the collation process, based on our observation and reports from our observers, had not just challenges, but undermined the credibility of the results collation process. And we must, really condemn the action of some of the actors, because we have reports where observers and even INEC officials were tear gassed, intimidated in the course of the collation. You had a collation process where it was disrupted, and you had situations where results were collated in locations that were not designated by the Electoral Act and guidelines. And all of this, are quite unfortunate developments for our electoral process. But later today, we will release our final statement to establish, some of this fact. But the concerns expressed by the Nigerian civil society situation from YIAGA Africa, the Center for Democracy and Development, Kimpact Development Initiative, Elect How, Nigerian Women Trust Fund, and TAF Africa are based on, our observation of the collation process. An election is a process comprising of different components. And so one component, if not managed transparently, can actually hurt the integrity of the entire process.
So from that statement, which I read here, it says reports of disruptions at ward and local government collation centers, intimidation of INEC officials, and attempts to collate results contrary to provisions of the Electoral Act and INEC guidelines. You've re-echoed that point here today. But when you look at the eventual outcome of this election, which is what a lot of people really want to get a sense of. So the APC has 291,000 votes. The PDP has 247,000 votes. Labour Party, 22,000. So those events that happened and that you raised concerns with, whose votes did it push up? Was it across board, or it was isolated to just, the APC actors, PDP actors, or Labour Party actors? It's important to also get that context right. Is this something that affected all of the results, or it was targeted at one party? Because people want to know, so which one should we start suspecting? Should we suspect all the results or one in particular?
Okay, like I mentioned earlier, I beg that you wait for our final results to provide all those details. But one thing I can tell you is that all of the parties are complicit, in the infractions that happened in the course of this election. All, at least the major political parties, were all involved in vote buying, as we have stated in our midday situational statement, as other observer groups have also stated, because the major political parties were seen buying votes, 10,000, 5,000 naira. So I think all the parties are complicit, and we will later today in our statement provide further details as to how all of this played out in the course of the results collation process. But all the parties, are complicit in committing these infractions.
Let me push this further. People have called this PDAPC. They've even added LP in that, saying they're all the same. So when you say they all participated in this, of course, we'll wait for that, your report, and I know it's going to be a big one, so don't worry. I will hold off the horses for now. But I want to also know how you rate the people's performance in this one. We're always focused on political parties, INEC particularly, which oversees the election, security agencies, who, by the way, were said to have been, well, to a large extent, matured and professional, even though we saw the vote buying in the presence of security officials in some parts. But the people, we don't quite talk about the people. Maybe we do, but not as much. So would you also rate the people in this election in terms of maybe vote buying, their conduct, even voter turnouts, which we'll come to? Would you rate the people, and how would you rate the conduct of the people in this one?
I think we should go to I'm glad that you bring the question about the people, because, prior to this election, we did at YIAGA Africa say this election is underpinned by three big tests. And the first test is the resilience test, which really relates to citizens and the voters and whether voters were going to show up. And what's the trend? We saw that 85% of registered voters collected their PVCs in Edo State. In fact, over 70% of the new registered voters have collected their permanent voters card. And some local government, especially Akoko Edo, was turning out 100% PVC collection rate. But one concern that we now saw yesterday is that in terms of turnout for the elections, the voters didn't pass the resilience test because we noted that there will be early warning signs of violence and also the rainfall. It could impact on turnout. Those were our projections. Now, what we saw on election day was that there was really poor turnout. 22%, turnout of voters is lower than the 27% that was recorded in the 2020 election. So the big question is, what happened, to the over 1.5 million people who collected their permanent voters card? Why didn't they defy, the rain? Although some voters showed up, if over 600,000 voters showed up in yesterday, we must commend those voters for the resilience that they demonstrated. Some of them stood in the rain, to cast their vote. They were also patient in the face of, the logistical challenge that was recorded during the election that led to late opening of polls. We need to commend them. But when you look at the turnout, it shows that, people didn't show up to vote in this election. And that is disturbing because this downward trend really suggests that we have a lot of work to do to continue to inspire confidence on the part of people. We as a country also have a lot to do, especially those in government have a lot to do to deliver good governance to the people so it incentivizes, participation. When you speak to voters, some of the concerns that they raise is why should they show up to vote when their lives have not improved? If you ask them, they will tell you the entire security deployment for this election, the threat for violence, which was quite high, even though the election was peaceful at the end of the day, really are factors that impede on voter turnout. So these are some of the issues, but we must commend the 600,000 people that showed up to cast their vote because this was an election that appeared the politicians were preparing for war and a showdown, but that they showed up defying all odds, defying the early warning signs of violence, and they were patient, they were understanding. I saw locations where INEC officials and materials arrived late, but the voters sat and they waited patiently, for those INEC officials. Is one encouraging dimension of this election.
Well, we'll talk about the dynamics, the change or the difference from presidential election turnout and the way people voted, or at least how they came out voting for the Labour Party. Imagine that over 300,000 people voted for a Labour Party and you had other people voting for the other parties. If you put that together, clearly more people turned out. Maybe we'll talk about that dynamics, but I want you to also speak to the performance of the people in that very tricky situation of vote buying, right? So it's one thing to offer, I understand that they offered bread, 5,000, 10,000. I mean, it was that much, or that little, I should say, being offered. So it's one thing to offer. It's another thing for people to say, well, I'm not going to take it. I'll vote for my conscience, or I will take it and still vote for my conscience, or I will take it and vote against my conscience. So if you were to rate the people in that light, because vote buying was, there was a lot of it across the party lines, as you said, what would be your rating of the people? Maybe a snippet into your report.
Well, I'm glad that you highlighted it. It is out there in our midday situational statement. We were very clear and identified local governments where votes were bought for 10,000 naira per voter. And it's really disappointing because when you have incidents of vote buying, it questions, the integrity and the legitimacy of the entire process, because you can actually say that the turnout is purchased turnout. You can also say that the choices that they expressed was compromised because it wasn't out of free will. Because in some cases where we observed, vote buying, the whole secrecy of the ballot was not guaranteed. You had mercenaries who sat right in front of the ballot box, right in front of the voting cubicle. And when people cast their votes, they display who they voted for, and then they receive, the cash for their vote. So when you see this, and given the amount or the scale, of vote buying, it is troubling. And this voter behavior, puts a dent on our electoral process, and it's one that must be condemned. And voters need to understand that when they sell their votes, they lose their voice, because selling votes would lead to the leaders that already feel that they've bought their way into office, and they will have no regard for you or even defer to you on some of the decisions that they take. Because once you have sold your vote, those who are beneficiaries of it cannot claim that they hold power in trust for you, because what they already did is purchasing, that power in quotes from the people. And it's one that really undermines our democratic process. And we need to take, serious action as a nation. There's a reason why politicians are buying votes. They know that votes are counting. They know that the votes matter. And so they will do everything to buy the votes from you and compromise your choice. And we just need to continue to urge voters, to refrain from this particular terrible, unfortunate political behavior.
So is it safe to say then that government, and in this case, the result of the election is a reflection of the people? So I was saying that, well, the government or whoever is in power came from the people and is a reflection of the kind of people we have, or at least those who are in the majority. So is it safe to also say that, well, the people of Edo have come out to vote? Yes, there was perhaps purchased turnout, and this, of course, will affect the outcome of the election. But all in all, this is what the people want because they agreed to it in that sense. Is it safe to say that?
Well, it's safe to say that, but we cannot make that conclusion to a large extent, because there are people who still showed up to vote yesterday and expressed their free will. They weren't incentivized by money. And so when we look at this, we can't make that sort of blanket judgment, because it will be fair to the voters who showed up and expressed their free will and expressed their choice. What we are saying is, as observers, we have identified this particular issue. At this moment, we may not be in the position, to say definitively if that's the case. But election is a process. And like I said, most of the observer groups will be issuing their statements. A lot of work is being done at the moment, checking data, trying to clean up the data. And just wait, when we release our report later today, we will provide all these details that responds to some of the questions.
Right. So let's talk about, by the way, you have whet a lot of appetites, particularly for this report. I'm sure a lot of people will be waiting to see what comes out of that. But it's quite interesting. We saw the people of Edo voting overwhelmingly for a Labour Party in the presidential election. And this Labour Party that said, we know they give shishi. So it's expected that, people weren't induced to vote for the Labour Party then. That is the assumption, because the party said we're not giving shishi. But what we're seeing during the governorship election is quite different. But it's still early days, definitely. I'd like you to touch a bit on the INEC's way of conducting election, because INEC played a major role in this one as well. Again, we saw late arrival of materials. I was reading a tweet earlier on saying It's literally the same issue. You can almost predict the issues that will come up. We saw local government elections across the country, and I imagine that YIAGA Africa had its eyes on those elections as well. Kwara, Enugu, Imo. We had some last week as well, and the same issues. Late arrival of materials, late arrival of election officials. So these are the same issues, but we always say that we improve, right? But we keep doing the same things. So naturally, the results would be the same. So is there anything fundamentally wrong? I don't know if it's with the INEC or the system INEC finds itself that we're not able to improve on our previous performance, particularly in those areas.
Well, you see, these perennial challenges of logistical issues have been here for too long. And it is safe to conclude that these logistical issues are not accidental. They are intentional. Because if they're not accidental, if they're not intentional, then we would have looked for a solution, to address this. There are three fundamental issues, Kayode. The first one is INEC goes into contract with transport union or road or motorists or car owners. They sign the contract or MOU. These unions and these transporters default on their contract. There's no consequence for defaulting on contractual obligations. In the next round of election, INEC still engages these transport workers. And so for all the previous elections where we've had logistical challenges, especially as a result of the non-availability or supply of vehicles on election day to deploy materials, what has been the action taken by INEC, to do what? To address this issue about default on the part of the transport union workers. Because in this election, the materials were at CBN. The materials went to the local government, but went to the INEC office. They now went to the local government from CBN. From the local government, they went to the racks. The problem was from the racks to the polling units on election day. And so must we continue to use these transport workers or transport unions who just show on the day of election decide to default intentionally? And don't forget that some of these transport unions, we know for sure, are beholden, to certain political interests. And so they sabotage the process, sabotage INEC's preparation. We hope that, INEC would learn from this particular experience and change and look for new ways of deploying election materials. And we just have to think about, whether there are other institutions that should be involved in this process. Continuing to use transport union or transport workers is one that really is something that we need to have a rethink. The second is there were cases where INEC officials were present, the cars were available, but there wasn't a security agency and a security personnel to accompany those materials, to the polling units. And the question is, with this level of deployment in this election, how come that there were still shortages of security personnel to convey, the materials and INEC officials from the racks, to the polling units? These are the issues, and you'll see situations where logistical issues can actually lead to voter suppression. And it's one trend that we saw in previous elections, because you tactically, disrupt INEC's deployment of materials to certain locations because you want to delay commencement in that particular location so that voting can go into the night. So it becomes easier to manipulate the election, or you want to use that to discourage voters, because when voters begin to hear that INEC officials have not showed up, they become agitated and some become discouraged and they go back. These are tools being used by political actors, not just in Nigeria. It's one of the tools in the playbook for election manipulation that we have observed across the world using logistics. But we need to have, a conversation about and about, accountability and consequence. When people who have made commitments to deliver certain services in the entire election value chain default in performing their duty.
So we can't keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. That's what they call madness. So I want us to touch a bit again on what we expect to be done after this while we await your report. First, INEC, this logistics matter, and all of the other issues that dogged the election. That's one. The people, and ensuring that, one, they don't get induced, or at least make politicians think that all you need to do is induce the people. You don't need to bring ideas to the table as much. Don't worry. Once elections are here, or in the build-up to elections, give them petrol, give them bread, give them 5,000, 10,000 T-shirts, face cap. They will vote for us. Because what that means is when the real business of governance starts, they'll probably just rinse and repeat what they were doing, or they will be exhausted because they're trying to recoup all of the investment that they made in the election. So the people have a role to play. And I don't know if you want to speak to the people this morning, because it's garbage in, garbage out, right, for the people. That's on the one hand. For INEC as well, I don't know if we have to rethink election logistics yet again, because we see, or we seem to be seeing influences in this process such that certain people are maybe denied the time, opportunity to vote for their preferred candidate. So those two major parties, the people, I'm not talking politicians here really, because they may hardly change. So the people and INEC.
I think for the people, it's just to urge them to maintain the peace and the calm. I think that prior to this election, everyone was worried, everyone was scared because of the tense political environment. And the people of Edo State, again, have demonstrated that they're a very peaceful people. And we want to urge them to maintain that calm and maintain the peace, because the cost, for violence is very, very high. The cost for violence is high. And more importantly, to say that if there are any issues, if you have any grievance, with the outcome of this election and this process, our laws are very clear as to what can be done, to ventilate those views. Now, INEC has, 7 days based on provisions of Section 65, to review declarations where those declarations have been made under duress or involuntarily, or where those declarations were made contrary to what the provisions of the Electoral Act. And like, the Election Observer Group said, INEC should invoke those powers where questions have been raised regarding the outcome of the elections, thoroughly investigate. And if, after its review, it discovers that there aren't any inconsistencies or there aren't any violation of the guidelines and the Electoral Act, then it should communicate to the stakeholders what are the findings of its review process. And that's what INEC needs to do. The second is there are collation officers who acted in manners and in ways that are unbecoming of collation officers. They didn't uphold the principle of transparency and credibility in the course of managing the ward collation and the local government collation. INEC needs to address this issue, especially those who subverted, the collation process. It is important as a way of building confidence on the part of the public. If it is established that either votes have been inflated or votes or results were manipulated, the consequential action INEC takes will go a long way in inspiring public trust and confidence in the Electoral Commission, especially for a process that was really seamless, save for the logistical hiccups and the commencement. 1-2 hours after 8:30, things stabilized and people were able to cast their votes. The process was really seamless until it came to results collation. And lastly is also the role that security agencies played in the course of the collation process. And I think that the police needs to thoroughly investigate some of the actions taken by its officers in the course of the results collation. But I think that Benin is peaceful, and it should remain that way. And if people have concerns about, the electoral process, they should seek redress, through the civil and legal means, trusting that those who have the capacity, those who have the role and the function of judicial review,
right,
will do so guided by the principles of justice, will do so guided by the principles of accountability and strong commitment to democratic practice.
So INEC's 7 days begin today, right? So they have 6 days now, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll wait to see if anything will come out of that. We rarely see that really. So we'll wait to see if things will change. That's on the one hand. And I should say that the security agencies are not out of the woods yet. Arrests should have been made if there was blatant vote buying, intimidation, manipulation. I want to believe that arrests were made, and I think that
by the EFCC,
but the police,
by the EFCC,
but the police, which is meant to lead, the security for this election. I hear that a lot of vote buying was done in the presence of security operatives. So the police must come out and tell us how many arrests were made, because a crime cannot be committed around you, a policeman, a law enforcer, and you look away. Mm-hmm. No. So clearly the police needs to do a lot of explanation to Nigerians. How many arrests have been made, and what is the process for prosecution in collaboration with INEC? So security, particularly police, is not out of the woods. And of course, politicians, we saw the vote buying that played out, APC, PDP, and nobody should blame the other. We saw your agents actively engaging in a lot of this, and we need to do better as a nation. But I'd like to thank you so much, Samson Itodo, Executive Director, YIAGA Africa. We're waiting that report. I'm sure it will be breaking news when it comes out. Thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll take a moment, but we're not done with this election just yet. We'll speak to one of the major players in the Edo governorship election and get a sense. So what exactly played out from their own part as political actors? That's in a moment. Stay with us.